But now I'm delighted to welcome someone who has been on the front lines of fighting the subversion of the British Isles into Airstrip 1 of the European federal superstate. And that, of course, is Brian Gerrish, former naval officer, and, of course, now with the British Constitution Group. And also, I might add, the man who basically was the first to lift the lid on the sinister common purpose organisation which has infested its operatives into every level of British society. So we're going to cover a host of interesting topics today. Brian Gerrish, good morning and welcome to the Alex Jones Show.
Yeah, good morning, Paul, and thank you and Alex and all the rest of the crew for giving me an invite to speak.
Well, you're welcome to be back on the show. First of all, obviously you've been a guest previously, but before we get into the whole Liam Fox issue and the cover-up surrounding that, just tell us about your background and how you first began to uncover groups like Common Purpose and what they were up to in the United Kingdom.
Okay, well, we'll keep it very short. I spent 21 years in the Navy as a warfare officer. I left in 1993. I got involved in a small business, started to become what I'll call a normal person. And then in my home city of Plymouth, which is down in the southwest of England, I started to discover massive fraud and corruption, and much of it was to do with public money. So I started to dig into that more, and strange things began to happen because essentially I started to be threatened and warned off, and I wasn't too impressed with that because I'd always believed that my country was generally law-abiding. But then things came to a head when I tried to start a little project to help give unemployed young people some skills training and some hope from the future. And it was obvious that the local elite did not want this project to happen. And when I started to investigate why, not only did I get threatened more, including death threats, but I discovered a very sinister little organisation called Common Purpose at work. And essentially, I'll say now with hindsight, because it's much easier now to look back and put the pieces together, the reason that I was treated in the way I was treated was because I was trying to help people, I was trying to help create jobs, I was trying to get confidence back into local communities, when unknown to me at the time, the government policy was the exact opposite. It was to destroy jobs, it was to break down communities, and it was to reduce young people to unemployed druggies. So that was the start of it. When I then began to really research into the subject and I began to get very good people helping me, we discovered that this organisation, Common Purpose, which calls itself a charity, but what it was really doing was inserting a very, very dangerous political agenda into everywhere it could get. And Common Purpose was and still is, it's in the political circles, it's in schools, it's in hospitals, it's in the military, and their so-called graduate leaders are pushing forward the overall political agenda which is causing such problem. Now, when you were setting up the show, somebody mentioned communism. We're not fighting communism, we're fighting something much more dangerous. It's Gramsci is the man we should be looking at. We should be looking at Saul Alinsky, and we should be looking at Gramsci, because this is Marxism, which is being imposed on America and Britain, and it's being done slowly, gently, piece by piece, in a very hidden, subversive way. But that is, in my view, is the ideology which Common Purpose is pushing.
Now, a lot of these issues can be found at Brian's website, and they actually publish a newspaper which I encourage people to subscribe to, and it's ukcolumn.org. Now, for our American audience who perhaps aren't aware of this, and if you're not, then you need to be, because it's very much a transatlantic controversy. And it takes on even more prominence given the news yesterday that Britain is basically now on a war footing to support the planned US and/or Israeli strike on Iran. And this was a major story last month in the United Kingdom, and it was, of course, the resignation of British Defence Secretary Liam Fox, which came as a result of his relationship with the lobbyist and all-round globalist insider Adam Werrity. And of course, Werrity, it turns out, was the frontman for this Atlantic Bridge Group, which in itself was funded by the Israeli lobby BICOM, with Werrity actually attending government meetings side by side with the British Defence Secretary on behalf of this pro-Israeli neocon faction. Of course, it led to Fox having to resign. Brian, this Werrity Fox Atlantic Bridge BICOM issue, I mean, the tentacles run deep. It was almost universally ignored by the British press, who merely concentrated on the fact that Fox had broke some ministerial code. They weren't interested about everything else that was going on behind the scenes. And we'll certainly get into some of that later. But just how deep does this scandal with Liam Fox, Werrity and all these shadowy lobbyist groups run?
Well, the answer to that is it runs very deep. I'll just pick up on your point of what the British media did at the time. It was very interesting to watch what happened, because most of the British media just simply focused on Liam Fox's relationship with Werrity as his best man, and the fact that they dressed in a similar style, and they clearly stayed with each other on a regular basis. So many of the press articles focused on the fact that there seemed to be a rather interesting, and some would say unnatural, relationship between Liam Fox and his best man. But one or two papers started to dig a bit deeper. But when they produced articles, the articles contained information, but it was very confusing. It was very hard to piece together what they were actually talking about. And I can say that we and a large number of other people have done a lot of research on this. And if I may, I'll just take listeners through some of the things that we now know. So if we set the scene, we've got British Secretary of State for Defence, Liam Fox. He chooses his best man as a personal advisor, and his best man actually makes out that he is a bona fide government advisor, and he then accompanies his best mate, Mr. Fox, on tours and missions around the world. So there was instant deception that you had somebody who was not security cleared being touted as if they were part of the British government. That was Mr. Werrity. But Werrity had set up a number of organisations which we really need to look at very closely, and certainly Americans need to look at this very closely, because these are the tentacles that are working very hard to drag both Britain and America into further wars. But I'll just add at this point that, of course, Britain almost has no armed forces left. Most Americans will simply not understand how big the cuts have been on British military. So when our Prime Minister David Cameron is talking about wars against Iran, it's not going to be a major effort by the British. It's going to be American lives that are lost fighting Cameron's warmongering. But if I just bring you back to Mr. Werrity, Paul has already mentioned Atlantic Bridge, which was a so-called charity to help drive and improve relations between Britain and America. But that charity was actually closed down by the formal body in UK because it was highly political. And under the charity rules in the United Kingdom, you can't be political if you're a charity. So the Atlantic Bridge organisation was fraudulent itself. And when you look behind, we find, for example, people like John Falk, who's a US defence lobbyist, linked in with an organisation called Kestrel in the USA, which is ultimately linked through to Blackwater or Z. So we're not seeing just an innocent best man who happened to set up a charity to help relations with Britain and America. We're seeing a man who's intimately connected in with what I regard as international mercenary organisations. One of the papers that added a bit more was the Independent on Sunday, because they ran an article which was actually front page, and it said that Werity, and let's remember, he is the man right alongside the then Secretary of State for Defence in Britain, Mr. Fox. Their headline said that Werity plotted with Mossad to target Iran. So what was happening at the time the Leanne Fox scandal came to the surface was that it was clear that in the background work was going on in order to help start some form of conflict with Iran. And it was very interesting that another British paper, the Daily Mail, ran some paragraphs in which it said that many officials in the Ministry of Defence in Britain were becoming very, very concerned because they knew that people were acting in a private capacity to influence defence. It's more like offence policy. And they also warned that Mossad was using useful idiots in the British government in order to help foment trouble on the world stage. So it was really quite interesting that if you did look right the way across the media, you could find a lot of information, but it was all in bits. There were other names that came forward in this scandal. One of them was Matthew Gould, the UK ambassador to Israel. He's an interesting character because he was originally the private parliamentary secretary to David Miliband. Of course, we've now got one of the Miliband brothers, Ed Miliband, who's leading the Labour Party in Britain. If we delve into his background, he comes from an absolutely dedicated Marxist family. So there's another little interesting bit. We find venture capitalists who donate £125,000 to the Conservative Party. But the real meat of it is in relation to an organisation called Pargav. And this effectively was a lobbying group that Adam Werity had set up. And once we start to look at Pargav, we find not effectively, because it's been reported in the press, but it's been hidden. We have a Finnish-Israeli arms dealer who's worth some £2 billion. We have him connected to Pargav, and we learn that he donated £15,000 for Cameron's leadership campaign. So here we have David Cameron, who appears out of nowhere, we call him a toff schoolboy from Eton. He suddenly appears as the British Prime Minister, and now we're seeing that the type of people who funded his leadership campaign are major international arms dealers. But it gets better than that, because we can start to actually see that there are other groups involved. So there's the Thamires investment group, which was paying money into Pargav as well. And that company owns, it is said, about 40% of the major property in Las Vegas. Casinos, it's got property in Washington, New York, Times Square. So the people who are clustered around Mr. Werity and therefore intimately linked with Mr. Fox are certainly major and extremely wealthy people, including arms dealers. But we can get in a little bit deeper on this, because there was also a hedge fund called CQS involved. This was also linked through a man called Oliver Hilton into Pargav, and CQS invested some £21.5 million in a high-tech firm called L3. And when Mr. Fox scrapped Britain's Nimrods, these are equivalent to the the American maritime patrol aircraft, such as the then P-3. They're the same age. But the moment those aircraft were scrapped, they cut the wings off them, they destroyed all the simulators. But by an amazing coincidence, they were then replaced by 3 Boeing RC-135 aircraft worth $650 million, and those aircraft came from L3.